around the globe are more connected to each other than ever before. Information and money flow more quickly than ever, and goods and services produced in one part of the world are more increasingly available in all parts of the world. International travel is more frequent, and international communication is commonplace. This is globalization. Pharmaceutical companies have embraced globalization as a core component of their business models, especially in the realm of clinical trials. This phenomenon raises important questions about the economics and ethics of clinical research and the translation of trial results to clinical practice. Who benefits from the globalization of clinical trials? What is the potential for exploitation of research subjects? And finally, are trial results accurate and valid? Good afternoon, Victor Hayes and fellow C3s. My name is Christine Burke, and this is my colleague Sharon Gill. Today we are going to talk to you about the globalization of the pharmaceutical industry. Sharon will be talking to you about the inherent benefits, and I'll be talking to you about the inherent dangers of conducting clinical trials overseas.
In developing countries, healthcare systems are not as sophisticated as those found in the developed world. In fact, it is often argued that without clinical trials in developing countries, most patients would not have access to any form of healthcare at all. Consider this. In America, there is one doctor for every 384 American patients. In India, however, there are 1,667 patients for one Indian doctor. In addition, the average American patient consumes nearly $7,000 a year in medical care, while the average Indian patient consumes only $39 in the same time frame. What the developing world needs right now is more healthcare, not less, and clinical trials provide patients, many of whom may have never seen a doctor before, with potential therapies and medications that they would not have otherwise received. It is, in a nutshell, better than nothing.
Well, I'm glad that you're able to sleep at night thinking that pharmaceutical globalization is better than nothing. But will you be able to sleep tonight after I tell you that prescription drugs kill over 200,000 Americans every year? As a city the size of Kitchener gets wiped out, the number of clinical trials increases, and so does the body count. When you look at international healthcare, it's true. There is a drug market in most developing countries. But consider the fact that the United States, Europe, and Japan dominate more than 80% of the global drug market. In fact, all this foreign experimentation you were talking about can hardly be counted on to cure malaria or cure tuberculosis. This is because remedies are most often tested for arthritis, obesity, and heart disease, all diseases of people in the developed world. In order to address the comment, whatever we do is better than nothing, you should all inform yourselves of a case that took place in January of 2001. As part of a trial for a new drug, Discovery Laboratories planned to administer placebos to 325 deathly ill Nigerian infants as part of a venture to approve their newest drug. They rationalized that these poor patients wouldn't be able to afford cost-effective or effective drugs anyways. They also admitted to the FDA that this drug wouldn't be any more effective than the 4 other drugs already on the market for that same illness. Now here comes the loophole. In order to attain FDA approval, you only need to show that the drug is better than nothing. Sound familiar?
Globalizing clinical research solves the pharmaceutical paradox. While the average American brings home more than 10 prescriptions a year, only 1 in 350 is willing to undergo drug testing. Phase 2 clinical trials, which provide information on a drug's effectiveness for a specific condition or disease, and Phase 3 clinical trials, which provide information about the side effects of a drug, typically involve thousands of patients. Finding enough people willing to participate within a limited time frame is next to impossible in developed countries. And problems with recruitment delay the already long drug approval process. Even if North Americans were willing to participate in clinical trials, they take so many medications already that they make poor lab rats. To prove a new drug is effective and safe, patients with no other disease states and with no other medical treatments under their belt are ideal. This is because researchers need to know whether the effects a patient may be experiencing are from a drug they are testing or from an unaffiliated treatment. Patients recruited from Eastern Europe, South Africa, Latin America, and China, for example, are less likely to be on medications or to have received treatments in the past, thereby lowering the chances of a botched test result.
Although it may seem like we are forced into conducting trials overseas because Americans are unwilling to play guinea pig, we need to become aware of the dangers. Most obvious is that people from Asian, African, and South American countries have a different genetic makeup. For a variety of reasons, they metabolize drugs differently than Americans do. and these differences have been shown to affect the safety and effectiveness of our medications. The point here is that genetic diversity is often not considered in study design or interpretation of these trial results. And unfortunately, the threats do not stop here. Overseas testing has left many subjects in terrible medical conditions, often leading to death. One such case in New Delhi left 49 babies dead at the hands of drug testing. The babies were given a variety of new drugs to treat everything from blood pressure to brain inflammation, and these blood pressure drugs had never before been given to anyone under age 18. The editor of an Indian medical journal said it was obvious that the trials were intended to improve Western countries with no consequence or benefit for India, thereby using Indian children as guinea pigs.
Government bureaucracy overwhelms clinical research in North America. Regulations governing the conduct of clinical trials have become more and more complex, placing a greater burden on investigators in terms of compliance, documentation, and training. Although these regulations are well-intended, they are generally uncoordinated and frequently are not subjected to empirical studies to determine which elements improve upon the conduct of trials and which elements add cost without benefiting participants or the research mission. The FDA estimates that it takes a little over 8 years to test a drug and approve it for use by the general public. Conducting clinical trials overseas does not mean that there is no red tape. However, with rapid recruitment and fewer regulatory bodies to go through, the process can be significantly speeded up.
In 1988, the World Health Assembly adopted an ethical criteria for medicinal drug promotion, dedicated to the rational use of drugs. However, many still complain that these guidelines have been largely disregarded. This is due in part to the fact that the pharmaceutical industry practices according to its own set of ethics. Another big push for the administration of foreign clinical trials is yet another loophole in FDA regulations. If studies in the United States suggest that a drug has no benefit, trials from abroad can still be used to secure this approval. Often, the FDA does not even bother to investigate into these trials, releasing the drug to the public in good faith. And in 1990, such blatant negligence resulted in the death of 12 overseas children, with what eventually became a class action lawsuit after a researcher in the United States was caught falsifying over 92% of the company's trial results. The researcher was sentenced to 57 months in prison, but 12 innocent babies died, all because of one big oversight.
Pharmaceutical companies can realize substantial cost savings by conducting trials in developing countries. A pharmaceutical executive reported that a first-rate academic medical center in India charges approximately $1,500 to $2,000 per case report, which is less than 1/10 that of a second-tier center in North America. Since clinical research costs are driven by human labor, much of this cost difference can be attributed to the lower salaries of physicians, nurses, and study coordinators in developing countries. In the United States, the costs of conducting clinical trials have generally outstripped federal funding for clinical research and strained the industry's site-level research budgets, thereby making it difficult to allocate resources to research and development. Pharmaceutical companies that conduct Phase 2 and Phase 3 clinical trials overseas have seen an increase in their profit margins, and this allows them to conduct more research, thereby permitting them to develop new drugs and treatment programs to fight various diseases. It is important to note that scientists working for pharmaceutical companies were the ones who discovered drugs that could control AIDS. Through globalization, not only are many more drugs being made available to third world countries, but with higher profit margins, funds can be funneled into AIDS treatments, for example, and the search for a cure can finally be realized.
Although it is undeniable that profit is needed to improve research and development, there are startling cases where research has gone too far and at the cost of human lives. Most notoriously, in the late 1990s, the National Institute of Health and the Centers for Disease Control funded a study where Western scientists withheld treatment for HIV-infected pregnant women in developing countries. In this particular case, the scientists knew that the drugs would greatly reduce the rate of HIV in these infants. Instead, hundreds of them needlessly contracted HIV while Western doctors stood idly by, denying them treatment. They justified that observing the medical state of these untreated patients compared with that of the treated patients was the best way to determine whether the experimental drugs were effective. In the end, hundreds of lives were sacrificed because researchers decided that the demands of scientific rigor required that some sick patients go untreated.
With so much conflicting evidence surrounding the benefits and dangers of the globalization of the pharmaceutical industry, it is difficult to look at this from just one perspective, but that is precisely what is needed. Informing ourselves is necessary in order to understand and appreciate the overarching effect this has on our world. We can argue back and forth all day long about whether this is improving or hindering the quality of our lives, but the big picture is this. Tougher international protections are essential so that we can ensure that the growth of the pharmaceutical industry is positive for everyone. Thank you.
Shut that computer off.
By the way, this computer just insulted me, called me pathetic, I swear to God. I swear to God. Across, I was looking to see, my image.